Hello, welcome to Luckvoice Videos. Today on Luckvoice Videos, I decided to jump into quite a controversial topic when it comes to Sri Lankan economy, which is the public transportation and the nationalization of the public transportation, particularly the bus transport. As you already know, Sri Lanka's bus transportation was nationalized in 1958 under the SWRD Bandaranaike Prime Minister's government. However, to see what led to that and after that, it's good to have a look at how and what the bus transportation of Sri Lanka was in the early years. Now, since 1907, there was some form of bus transportation in Sri Lanka. From 1907 to 1940, the bus transportation in Sri Lanka was done by individual bus owners, providing the services in the areas that they suit to be profitable. This led to various complaints, various inefficiencies, and some parts of the population being disenfranchised out of this service. So, because of all these complaints, the British Imperial government, who were controlling Sri Lanka at that time in 1940, made structural changes to regulate the bus service. And the way they did that was to, instead of having individual bus owners running their bus services, they created regionalized bus companies. They were limited liability companies owned by entrepreneurs in Sri Lanka who put their money and bought their buses and ran the buses as a business. So various regional parts of Sri Lanka and urban parts of Sri Lanka had a number of bus companies running. And this model continued from 1940 until 1948, where Sri Lanka's bus transportation was run through a myriad of privately owned limited liability companies who run the bus services. Now, there were pros and cons to this model. On the pro side, all these bus companies were well maintained. They ran an efficient structure, and they were profitable. They provided employment. And also, they provided reasonably good services around the areas, the key areas as well. And most importantly, because these bus services were regulated, there was an answerable body for the people to complain if they had a problem. And the other thing is that because the companies were profitable and running well, the government earned some very valuable tax income from the operations of these bus companies. On the disadvantages, because the business was purely profit motive, there were complaints that these bus companies did not focus on providing services for some of the rural areas where the ridership was not high. And also there were complaints that the buses were too crowded on the city areas at peak hours because there wasn't enough sufficient number of buses supported by the bus companies. And also there was also complaints that at the nighttime bus services were not properly provided as well. So there were situations like that. And the other main problem was that when people were running long distance traveling, providing long distance travels, they had to get a couple of transits, like get off from one bus and get to another one. So that created an inconvenience, not a very customer-centric model for those people who were riding long distances. So because of these funds, there were a couple of surveys done in 1948 and 1956 by Ratnam and also Jayaratna Pereira. There were a number of recommendations coming out of these surveys. One of the recommendations was to consider nationalization. However, what the government did instead of going all at nationalization was that in 1951, the Sri Lankan government, which was an independent country by then, brought in some structural changes on how the bus transportation was done, primarily looking at improving the quality of service of the bus service in Sri Lanka. However, this took a tectonic shift in 1956 when SWRD Bandaranaike became the prime minister in 1956. He took a bold decision to nationalize the bus industry, meaning in 1958, the government took over all the assets all the buses of the private bus companies and created the Central Transportation Board and nationalized the bus transportation industry. Now, from the outset, it looked like an attempt to address the shortcomings and providing a quality of service that is desirable for the population, which looks like that. However, there were allegations that it is more politically motivated than looking at the large economic need, because the reason being, almost all of these bus company owners supported the United National Party, which was the opposition at that time, and SWRD Bandaranaike wanted to cut the funding sources for the opposition by nationalizing the business run by the UNP supporters. So, and the other side, it was also alleged that creating the CTB, the Central Transportation Board, was kind of an overarching government oversight and trying to take over a public sector enterprise and trying to create a government monopoly. Now, the result of that was from 1958 to 1980, Sri Lanka's bus transportation was entirely done by the CTB. Now, of course, it expanded the services, but also simultaneously, CTB started incurring heavy financial losses year after year after year. And these local losses accumulated over time. And all these losses went to the government treasury, and the government treasury either had to borrow or use reserves to fund these large funding gaps of the CTB between its operational expenses and the operational income. And this became a major spending cost center for the government for many decades because of the losses it made. Because it was stretching itself too thin, the losses of this public enterprise was inevitable because of its very structure. And the other problem was that because it was a public sector organization, it soon became one of the more corrupt organizations as well, where successive governments, when the governments come in, the ministers and influential people with the government use this as a place to provide employment for their supporters, because it's a public sector, state-owned enterprise. As any other state-owned enterprise, the government ministers and their friends are able to influence the hiring process to give jobs that may or may not serve a purpose for the organization. All in all, CTB became a huge loss-making body every year. And it was in 1980 that the government of J.R. Jayawardena as the president decided to again allow private bus transportation back into the system of Sri Lanka, because they realized that sustaining CTB as the sole transportation provider for the nation was not a sustainable business model for the Sri Lankan government. However, J.R. Jayawardena also made a mistake, in my opinion, that rather than going back to the limited liability bus companies that they had until 1958, J.R. Jayawardena went right back to 1907 and introduced individual bus owners again. And that was a tried and tested and failed method. But unfortunately, that's what the government did in 1980. And that's the model we have from then to now in 2023. We still have individual bus owners riding side by side with the CTB still running its operation, still making losses. As I learned in the last year, CTB had made a loss of something in the range of 3 billion rupees. So it's a massive loss-making body even today. So when you look at these facts, one can say that it's a major mistake, major policy error, policy blunder done by the Sri Lankan government to establish a CTB instead of finding a solution. Now, if you look at the problems that the private bus companies had in 1958, the proper solution would have been the government to put a strong monitoring mechanism, pass legislation, and make the companies accountable to provide mandated services, like provide some service level agreements for the bus companies, how many bus services should be there for the rural areas, how much bus service should be at the night time, what should be the maximum number of passengers in a bus, and do you need any special arrangements for students, etc. And also just make sure that continuous routes will be available for the long distance travelers. Those are the things that the government could have done through legislation, and also have a conversation with the bus companies and finding out, because to provide those services, the bus companies will have to incur an additional cost. And it's only fair for the government for particularly chip in for targeted subsidiaries for those things that the bus companies have to go over and above their operating expenses to provide those extended services. Now, that would of course cost government some money, but I can guarantee if you do the math, that cost of targeted subsidization of rural services, increasing services on the cities, the peak hours, etc., will only be a fraction of the loss that the government was making by trying to maintain this inefficient central transportation board. And that is the reality. That would have been a much more robust structure. And the other thing is, had that been done, even after 1958 up to today, the bus companies would have profited, and out of the profit, government would have continued to earn revenue of corporate taxes from all those multiple bus companies operating in the country, which is a big thing for the Sri Lankan government, because now we are talking how much losses the government makes due to various state-owned enterprises. So this would have been one of those loss-making state-owned enterprises of the balance sheet of the Sri Lankan government. So I think if you look at the facts and if you do a proper retrospective, looks like in 1958, the Sri Lankan government made a mistake by establishing CTB as opposed to making structural changes to make the existing limited liability bus companies operate better. Again, I hope that the current government will take note of it and do the right thing and think about going back to that structure that existed between 1940 and 1958 to have regionalized bus companies, which seems to be a better operating model for the bus transportation in Sri Lanka. So I thought of sharing this with you in Luckvoice videos today, and invite you to provide your comments. Go to the Luckvoice Canada Facebook, Luckvoice Canada YouTube, and provide your comments. Engage in a discussion. You may agree or disagree, or agree to disagree, but we will continue the discourse and try to bring around situations and topics of this nature in the future as well. Thank you.